Charles Manson was possibly the best-connected killer in American history. Even stars who didn't personally know the man felt the repercussions of his crimes, and those who had the misfortune of meeting him never forgot it, if they were lucky enough to survive. Sharon Tate has the most tragic connection to Charles Manson for obvious reasons. Although her husband, the director Roman Polanski, wasn't at home on August 9, 1969, she was, along with friends Abigail Folger, Folger's boyfriend Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, and Jay Sebring, when members of the Manson family stormed the house and brutally murdered them all. Although the most common narrative is that Manson chose the house to carry out high-profile killings designed to start a race war, it was a little more complicated than that. In the months leading up to the murders, Manson was involved in violence of a more hands-on kind. In May, he shot but didn't kill drug dealer Bernard Lotzapapa Crow. A couple of months later, Manson had some of his followers go collect from a guy who supposedly owed him money, Gary Hinman, but things went bad. They tortured Hinman for 2 days, after which Manson cut off Hinman's ear. Then Manson associate Bobby Beausoleil killed him. Beausoleil was arrested driving Hinman's car with the murder weapon inside. The date was August 6th. Manson was worried Beausoleil, now in jail, would turn him in, so 3 days later, he dispatched his followers to the Cielo Drive house with orders to kill. The plan was to make it look like the same person who killed Hinman had committed these murders, which Manson hoped would lead to Beausoleil's release. It didn't work. Danny Trejo is one of those people who have packed a lot of living into a single life, including the time he spent in jail with Charles Manson. It happened long before the murders. In his autobiography, Trejo, My Life of Crime, Redemption, and Hollywood, Trejo describes Manson, writing, "He was so poor, he didn't have a belt, and instead used a piece of string to keep his pants up. He was like a 5-foot, slick little wimp, but he had the jargon of prison and jail. He thought he was slick." Trejo said that Manson even approached him and his cellmates looking for protection, but he also shared something very chilling. He believed Manson could have been a professional hypnotist. For example, he once sat down with Trejo and walked him through the process of shooting up with heroin. Trejo recalled, "Even before I fake fixed, I could taste it in my mouth. Any junkie knows what that is like. By the time he described it hitting my bloodstream, I felt the warmth flowing through my body." According to prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, Manson once tried to woo Dean Martin's daughter, Dina. While that didn't pan out, he had more success with actor Angela Lansbury's daughter, Dee Dee. Lansbury had no idea what trouble her daughter was getting into. According to multiple sources, she actually gave Dee Dee a note saying the teenager had permission to hang out with the long-haired Manson crew. Unlike most of Manson's women, Dee Dee never moved in with him. Instead, Manson picked her up after school, and they went on massive spending sprees, financed by Angela Lansbury's credit cards. Of course, no good scam lasts forever, and eventually the cards were cut off, and when that well ran dry, Dee Dee was out of the Manson family. Beach Boy Dennis Wilson was a notorious womanizer, which is probably why he picked up 2 female hitchhikers one day while driving home. The women were part of the Manson family, and when they told Charlie they'd met a Beach Boy, Manson thought it was his chance to finally score a record deal. Without invitation, the family moved into Wilson's house, and Manson quickly impressed Wilson with his spiritual beliefs. Of course, it didn't hurt that he also liked fooling around with the family women, but when Wilson tried to convince his fellow band members Manson was the real deal, they weren't interested.
Of all the Beach Boys, they had unwittingly met the one who would be most open to their charms.
Meanwhile, the family took full advantage of their new benefactor. They used his clothes to make robes for Manson. They ran up Wilson's credit cards and had him pay their medical bills. In just a few months, the family cost him over $100,000 and wrecked one of his Ferraris. Wilson was so scared of Manson by this point that he simply moved out and let his lease expire, forcing the landlord to kick out the cult. But Wilson eventually got his revenge when he took one of Manson's songs, Cease to Exist, rewrote it as Never Learn Not to Love, and took sole credit as composer. Naturally, this didn't sit well with Manson, who threatened Wilson's kid, sending a bullet as a message. Fortunately, the threat went no further, and Wilson later admitted, "I'm the luckiest guy in the world because I got off only losing my money." Many people, though, think Wilson never recovered from the guilt.
Stamped him as the loser forever.
Dennis Wilson might be the Beach Boys' most famous connection to Charles Manson, but he isn't the only one. His cousin Mike Love also had run-ins with Charlie. Love spoke with ABC News in 2017, calling the connection with Manson the worst thing that could possibly happen, and it gets stranger.
My cousin Dennis wanted us all to join Manson's family.
All this happened at a time when the Manson family was more about free love and less about murder. Wilson was obsessed with Manson and his harem of devoted followers, but Love was less impressed. In a pitch to get the rest of the group to join the family, Manson invited them to Wilson's house, where they were all living at the time. Love recalled that he was one of 2 people wearing clothes, and when Manson invited him to partake in a post-dinner acid trip, he declined. Love went off to take a shower, and Manson followed him into the bathroom.
Charlie Manson stood there and looked up at me and said, "You can't leave the group."
Love got out of the house, but he was shaken by the ordeal. And it gets weirder. His then-wife Suzanne was having an affair with Wilson. Love wrote in his memoir, Good Vibrations, that after he split with his wife, she'd often go out and leave the kids with a babysitter. And that babysitter? It was Susan Atkins, who witnesses later identified as the one who wrote Pig on the Cielo Drive door in Sharon Tate's blood. The story of the Mamas and the Papas is so tawdry, over-the-top, and downright shudder-inducing that it borders on the ridiculous, and it includes a bizarre connection with Charles Manson. Back in the day, wannabe musician Manson was hitting all kinds of free love parties and getting his groove on alongside both Mama Cass Elliot and John Phillips. Does it get stranger? Of course it does. In his memoir, Papa John, Phillips spends a good amount of time talking about his friendship with Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. And if you think you can see where this is going, you definitely cannot. Phillips wrote that when the news of the murders broke, everyone was worried about him because he was often at the Tate Polanski house. Weeks passed, and Polanski started his own investigation into John Phillips. Polanski allegedly went as far as breaking into Phillips' home with a police test kit to look for evidence. Obviously, he didn't find any. But what did Polanski think was Phillips' motive? Payback for Polanski's earlier fling with Michelle Phillips. Things came to a head one night when Polanski allegedly grabbed Phillips, held a cleaver to his throat, and demanded to know if he'd been behind the murders. Papa John assured him that he had not, and once Manson's trial started, according to Phillips at least, life was more or less back to normal. At one time, the Spahn Ranch was a highly sought-after shooting location for movies and TV shows like Bonanza. Ranch owner George Spahn allowed the Manson family to move in exchange for having work done around the property. They'd come across the ranch sometime in 1967, and according to what Bryan Cranston revealed on the Dan Patrick Show, that was about the same time he and his cousin would go to the ranch to rent horses and go horseback riding. The then 12-year-old Cranston was just getting ready to set out one day when something weird happened.
Some guy came in and started screaming, "Charlie's on the hill! Charlie's on the hill!"
The kids were startled, but the stable owner told them not to worry about it. Everybody else who was there jumped on horses and took off at a gallop. About 20 minutes into the ride, they passed a group of horses and riders moving in single file. As Cranston recalled,
"In the middle of this pack, there was one little man with black hair and dark, dead eyes."
Guess who? Cranston remembers Manson weaving back and forth on the saddle, out of his mind, looking like he was ready to fall off his horse at any second.
And my cousin said, "That must be Charlie."
The boys forgot all about it until they saw the news of the Manson family murders a year later. More than anything else in the world, Charles Manson wanted to be a rock star. He believed it was his destiny, and he spent an inordinate amount of time trying to impress producers and other singers. He performed for Mama Cass Elliot, and Bobby Beausoleil tried to sell some of Manson's songs to Frank Zappa. Manson also tried to win over Neil Young. The two met at Beach Boy Dennis Wilson's house. While they were hanging out, Manson took Young's guitar and improvised a few songs. Young described Manson's songs in his book, Waging Heavy Peace, writing, "They were kind of like Dylan, but different because it was hard to glimpse a true message in them, but the songs were fascinating. He was quite good."
He wasn't what you call a songwriter. He was like a song spewer.
Young promised to spread Manson's name around town and help him get a recording contract. Tragically for many, Manson's musical career never panned out. If you know anything about Charles Manson, you know he was obsessed with the Beatles. He first heard their music while serving time for forgery, but as the years went by, his relationship with the band took a dark turn.
They come to represent to Charlie Manson what he wants most: fame, power.
By the time he was a cult leader, Manson claimed the Beatles were sending him secret messages in their songs. In fact, he felt the White Album was one big prophecy meant especially for the family. According to Manson, the Beatles were predicting an apocalyptic revolution called Helter Skelter. During this uprising, black people would slaughter all the white people except for the Manson family, who would enslave the black people and rule the world. For proof, Manson pointed to the songs Blackbird and Happiness is a Warm Gun. Manson also cited Revolution 9 as evidence, claiming the song was connected to the Book of Revelations, Chapter 9.
Manson said the locusts that were going to fly out of the bottomless pit weren't really locusts, they were the Beatles.
Manson also claimed the Beatles needed his help to survive the apocalypse, and that their song Honey Pie was a plea for the cults to travel to England. And on top of all that, he believed the Fab Four wanted him to write a response album, thus justifying his desire to become a rocker. As further proof of his crazy claims, he explained how the song Sexy Sadie was named after Manson follower Susan Atkins, a woman he'd coincidentally nicknamed Sadie. At the site of the Manson family murders, they used the blood of their victims to write words from Beatles songs on the walls, including Helter Skelter, which they misspelled. And after their arrests, Manson's followers were genuinely confused why the Beatles weren't coming to their defense. In the 1960s, the Laurel Canyon area was known as a hotbed of inspiration and artistry that would change music forever, thanks to residents like Joni Mitchell, Cass Elliot, Jim Morrison, and scores of others, including Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa's Laurel Canyon house was always open and inviting, a place where anyone and everyone was welcome. It was magical for a time at least. Eventually, the parties, drugs, and lifestyles got more extreme, and when the Manson family murders went down, things were suddenly not so fun. According to the documentary Zappa, the Zappas closed their doors before the murders happened. It was Gail who recounted the fact that after run-ins with their nearby neighbors, who she described as creepy, the Zappas decided to sell their house and move out of the area entirely. And guess who the creepy neighbors were?
One of the reasons why I said let's get the out of here, because Manson had set up shop on the mountain behind us at the log cabin.
After the Manson murders, Hollywood freaked out, and the guy who panicked the most was the king of cool himself, Steve McQueen. He had a legitimate reason too. It took a shockingly long time for the police to solve the Manson killings. It wasn't until family member Susan Atkins was arrested on unrelated charges that detectives broke the case. While behind bars, Atkins admitted the killings to several inmates, and she also made another claim. According to Atkins, the family had a celebrity death list, and they were planning on killing Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Tom Jones, Frank Sinatra, and McQueen. Of course, it should be noted that Atkins was mentally disturbed, and the death list could have been completely made up. According to one LA prosecutor, Atkins was the scariest of the Manson girls, and she was the one who actually murdered a pregnant Sharon Tate. But once he heard about the death list, McQueen started carrying a gun, and who could blame him? In 1968, Sharon Tate appeared in a Dean Martin movie called The Wrecking Crew, a spy comedy featuring lots of martial arts. Since Martin and Tate weren't fighters, the legendary Bruce Lee was brought in to teach them how to look cool while throwing kicks. While Lee thought Martin was lazy and clumsy, Lee's words, he was impressed with Tate's sidekicks. Roman Polanski soon hired Lee for private lessons. Lee was also connected to Jay Sebring. The hairstylist introduced him to the producer of the Batman series. The producer then cast Lee as Kato in The Green Hornet. After the murders, Polanski was paranoid, even suspecting his friends were involved in the killings. He actually bugged houses and checked friends' cars for bloodstains, but things took a twist when police officers found a pair of glasses at the crime scene. When Lee admitted he couldn't find his glasses anywhere, Polanski began to wonder if he'd murdered his wife. The director actually took Lee to an eye doctor and bought him a new pair of glasses just to see what kind he wore. Little did Polanski know, the glasses from the crime scene actually came from Manson himself. The mastermind had visited the Cielo Drive house after the murders and dropped little clues, like the glasses, to throw off the cops. Whether or not you're a Marilyn Manson fan, you probably know that's not his real name. The rocker was born Brian Hugh Warner, but he adopted his stage name in honor of Marilyn Monroe and Charles Manson, whom he claimed were the two biggest icons of the 1960s. In a side note, Monroe was most famous in the 50s and died in 1962, but whatever. The singer took his Manson obsession even further when he covered one of the cult leader's songs, Sick City, in 2000. Evidently, Killer Manson was similarly impressed with Rocker Manson because he sent the singer a wildly incoherent letter. Here's a content warning: the thing is unintelligible. But in the name of journalism, a sample of what Charles Manson wrote reads, "What you don't do is what I will do. What you did a sing-along and let it roll and said how you saved me a lot of steps, I don't need. It's not a need or a want. Coupled, coup. Ghost dancers slay together, and you're just in my grave, sunstroker corona coronas coronae. You see me from under with it all standing on me. That's 2 dump trucks. 2 dump trucks indeed. Moving on. While Sharon Tate is the Manson family's most famous victim, she wasn't the only one to die on August 9th. After Tate, the most famous of the Cielo Drive victims was Jay Sebring, hairdresser to the stars. After learning to cut hair in the Navy, Sebring set up shop in Los Angeles as a self-described hair architect. He was known for his hip-hugger jeans and chambray shirts, and his salon was decked out with a stained-glass window and an ankh. When guests came to get their hair done, they could knock back champagne while they were attended by beautiful women. In addition to his snazzy style, Sebring was a pioneer.
Jay was different. He created a market where there really wasn't one. Not just a haircut, but men's hair fashion.
He was the first to give shampoos to men, and he popularized the use of handheld hair dryers in the US. Sebring charged an arm and a leg, but his clients could afford him. After all, he serviced Rock Hudson and Henry Fonda. Kirk Douglas hired him to work on Spartacus and praised him as a genius with hair. Sebring would fly out to Vegas to work on Frank Sinatra and supply his hairpieces, and he regularly took his clippers to Steve McQueen's house, along with plenty of cocaine. In his spare time, he raced cars with Paul Newman, and it said Warren Beatty partially based his movie Shampoo on Sebring's life.
I'm doing their hair, and they feel great, and they smell great. Makes me feel like I'm gonna live forever.
The stylist also briefly dated Sharon Tate before she dumped him for Polanski. Nevertheless, the two remained friends, and he often visited the actress at her home. Tragically, he was there the night Charles Tex Watson showed up, and Manson's lieutenant shot the hairdresser to death. In the 1960s, Kenneth Anger was a major player in the underground film scene. He was obsessed with everything from black magic to sadomasochism. His biker film Scorpio Rising influenced Martin Scorsese, popularized the use of pop music in movies, and carved out the motorcycle movie genre. Plus, his book, Hollywood Babylon, was full of Hollywood gossip, dishing dirt on stars like Marilyn Monroe. True, most of his stories were fiction, but readers didn't care, and the book made Anger a big name among pop culture aficionados. But while working on a film called Lucifer Rising, Anger ran into actor/wannabe musician Bobby Beausoleil. Anger grew obsessed with the young man, casting him as the protagonist of his film and letting Beausoleil live with him. The two sporadically worked on the movie, but they eventually had a falling out. That's when Beausoleil met Charles Manson, and it wouldn't be long before he ended up in prison for life. Beausoleil eventually reconnected with Anger from prison, even creating the soundtrack for the finished version of Lucifer Rising. While Michael Caine might seem as far removed from the Manson family's semi-transient, hedonistic lifestyle at the Spahn Ranch as it's possible to get, he did have a run-in with Charlie. Caine recalled the incident in his memoir, What's It All About?, remembering Manson as a scruffy little man who happened to be at one of the many parties thrown by Cass Elliot. In a dark twist, Caine remembers Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring also being at the party. Later in 1979, when Caine moved to Los Angeles, he described feeling like a refugee from my own beloved country and living in a strange land. For whatever reason, he found it comforting that his new home was within the jurisdiction of Beverly Hills Emergency Services. That is, until he learned that he was living a few hundred yards from the site of the Sharon Tate murders. In a 2008 interview with NME, Black Flag's Henry Rollins revealed something pretty shocking. Charles Manson saw him on MTV and liked his work so much that the two became pen pals. Rollins said, "We corresponded a few times in 1984. I'd just tell him about what we were doing with our new record, and he'd send back semi-lucid responses. His letters would always have swastikas on them, so they were easy to spot." And that wasn't the end of it either. In 2010, Rollins appeared at an event for Los Angeles radio station KCRW, where he played little-heard recordings of artists from Debbie Harry and Queen to Iggy Pop and Charles Manson. The way Rollins told it, he'd been struggling when he was approached by SST Records on Manson's behalf, asking him to produce an album for him. Manson did all the recording from prison, and the record, called Completion, was actually finished when the project was squashed. Rollins said that the company had started receiving death threats when news of the record leaked. Of the 5 copies that were made, Rollins kept 2 of them. As Doris Day won the hearts of audiences playing The Girl Next Door, her son Terry Melcher was making a name in the music industry. Melcher was a producer at Columbia Records. He helped produce hits like Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds. He also ran with a hip dating model Candice Bergen and hanging out with Dennis Wilson. It was thanks to Wilson that Melcher met Manson. The producer and cult leader often partied together, and Melcher enjoyed spending time with Manson's female followers. Manson believed Melcher could make him a star, so he gave the producer his demo tapes, but Melcher never listened to them. He then invited Melcher to Spahn Ranch for a special concert, but Melcher kept standing Manson up. He had a somewhat good excuse. At the time, Melcher was busy trying to save his mother from bankruptcy and didn't have time for a bunch of hippies. But Manson didn't see things that way. He grew impatient, to say the least. Eventually, Melcher did visit the ranch to hear Manson perform, after which he politely told the aspiring musician that it was time to put down the guitar.
He said, "I don't know what to do with you." In Charlie's mind, I think that was his biggest shot, and that's as close as he got.
Feeling betrayed, Manson shifted his attention from pursuing a music career to preparing for a race war. And when the killings began, the family attacked Terry Melcher's house on Cielo Drive. Only Melcher had moved out by then, and the new tenants were Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. After Manson and his followers were arrested, Melcher was understandably terrified. He hired bodyguards, bought guns, and had to take a tranquilizer before testifying against the cult leader. Fortunately, neither Manson nor any of his followers were allowed to roam free, and Melcher never ended up a checkmark on the family hit list. No discussion about the counterculture of the 1960s is complete without a mention of Timothy Leary and LSD.
Turn on, tune in, drop out.
It's no surprise that Manson bumped into Leary and LSD along the way. According to author Tom O'Neill, 1967 was a formative year in Manson's life. It was the year he began collecting and controlling the women who would eventually make up his family.
They were completely subservient. He would order them around and he was screwing them all.
67 was also the year he started experimenting with acid. Charlie was living in Haight-Ashbury at the time and was a regular visitor at an LSD clinic set up by Dr. Lewis Jolly West, a famous expert on hypnosis and brainwashing with a murky past that included the CIA and MKUltra.
Manson was really into mind control.
As for Leary, he ended up sentenced to 10 years in the California prison system for possession and transport of marijuana, which included a stint at Folsom Prison. And in a truth is stranger than fiction sort of moment, his next-door cellmate? It was, of course, Charles Manson, who reportedly went out of his way to tell Leary just how much he loved his work.